The wind, a razor across the high chaparral, carried no sound of mercy. Ilara's breath hitched, a small, trapped bird in her chest. Mayor Thorne's face, a mask of cold satisfaction, loomed above her. His words, clipped and final, were swallowed by the same wind that tore at her thin dress. Some lessons are learned the hard way, girl. Some refuse to learn at all then, the shove. Not a violent thrust, but a casual, contemptuous push, as if discarding refuse. She felt the edge of the ravine crumble beneath her worn boots, the sudden sickening lurch of gravity claiming her. Sky and rock and thorny scrub spun in a dizzying, silent scream. Her body met the unyielding earth not with one clean impact, but a series of brutal collisions, bouncing, tearing, until a final, jarring halt against a jagged outcrop of shale, halfway down the treacherous slope. Dust filled her mouth, the taste of blood and terror. She lay broken, the world a dimming, pain-filled blur. The figures above, Thorne and his two silent men, were sharp, dark silhouettes against the harsh sun for a moment, then they turned, already forgetting. They did not look back. Hours bled into one another. The sun arced, merciless. Cold seeped into her bones as shadows lengthened. She thought it was the end, a lonely, brutal finish. Then, a shadow fell over her, different from the evening gloom. A man. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face lost in the brim of a weathered hat. He did not speak. His movements were slow, deliberate, as he surveyed the impossible angle of her fall, the stillness of her form. Ilara watched through a slit of consciousness, too broken to move, too terrified to hope. He knelt, his presence surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. His hands, calloused and strong, prodded carefully, assessing the damage. Each touch, though meant to be careful, sent jolts of agony through her. She made no sound. Sound was a weapon others used. He found the pulse in her neck, a faint, thready beat. His expression, barely visible, did not change. With an economy of motion that spoke of long acquaintance with hardship, he began the slow, arduous task of freeing her from the rocks and thorns. He worked with a quiet intensity, his breath steady. When he finally lifted her, the pain was a white-hot nova, and she mercifully slipped into darkness. She awoke to the smell of wood smoke and old leather. A rough blanket covered her. Firelight flickered, casting dancing shadows on a low, timbered ceiling. She was on a cot, her body a symphony of aches. The man sat by the hearth, his back to her, mending a piece of tack. He didn't turn. He seemed to know she was awake. A cup of water sat on a small, unsteady crate beside her. Her throat was parched. Moving was an agony, but thirst was a more immediate tormentor. Slowly, wincing with every shift, she reached for it. Her fingers, scraped and bruised, fumbled. The cup rattled. He still didn't turn. He just continued his work, the rhythmic pull of needle and all a steady counterpoint to the crackling fire. The silence in the small cabin was vast, broken only by these small sounds. It was a different silence than the one on the ravine. This one felt less like an absence, more like a presence. He had brought her here, to this remote place. He had tended to her, in his own rough way. He had not spoken a word. And in the heart of her fear, a tiny, unfamiliar seed of something else began to stir. It was not hope, not yet. It was merely the stark realization that she was still alive. The wind howled outside, a mournful song across the empty plains, but inside the cabin, the fire burned steady. Silas, for that was his name though she did not know it, continued his routine as if her presence was a long-established fact. Days blurred. He would rise before dawn, the scrape of his boots on the wooden floor her first waking sound. He moved with a quiet efficiency, tending the fire, preparing a simple meal, usually oatmeal or stew, a portion of which he would leave on the crate beside her cot. He never pressured her to eat, never watched her. He would then depart, off to tend his few cattle, mend fences, or chop wood, the sounds of his labor distant but constant. Ilara remained mostly still, her body slowly, painfully knitting itself back together. The bruises faded from black to purple, then a sickly yellow. The cut scabbed over. The deeper aches remained, a constant reminder. She watched him when he was inside, his movements economical, his face weathered, etched with lines that spoke of sun and wind and sorrows unspoken. He was a man of few possessions, a worn Bible on a shelf, a single chipped mug from which he drank his coffee, tools hanging neatly on the wall. There were no pictures, no feminine touches, nothing to suggest another life had ever shared this space. His silence was a wall, but not an unkind one. It was a space she could occupy without the demand for words, for explanations, for gratitude she did not yet know how to feel, let alone express. She learned to read him by the set of his shoulders, the way he handled his tools, the rare moments his gaze lingered on the fire. There was a deep sadness in him, a quiet grief that resonated with her own unspoken terrors. She started to eat, small bites at first. The food was plain, but nourishing. He mended her torn dress, the stitches neat and strong, leaving it folded on the crate. He found an old, oversized shirt of his, soft from many washings, and left that too. She wore it, it smelled of wood smoke and him. One day, he brought in a small, wild bird with a broken wing. He fashioned a tiny splint, his large hand surprisingly deft. He placed the bird in a small wooden box lined with scraps of cloth, near the fire. He fed it water from his fingertip, crumbs of bread. Ilara watched this act of quiet care, and something in her chest loosened. He cared for broken things. Perhaps she was just another broken thing he felt compelled to mend. The thought was not comforting, but it was not terrifying either. She began to move more, testing her limits. A walk to the door, leaning heavily on the frame, to look out at the vast, empty landscape that surrounded the cabin. It was a harsh beauty, unforgiving but also immense, a place where one could get lost, or perhaps, be found. He never acknowledged these small efforts, but she sensed he noticed. One evening, as he sat cleaning his rifle, his movements precise and familiar, her stomach growled, a loud, embarrassing rumble in the quiet cabin. For the first time, she saw the faintest ghost of a smile touch the corners of his mouth before it vanished. He didn't look at her, but he put an extra piece of jerky in her portion of stew that night. The town, with its judgmental eyes and cruelties, felt a world away, though she knew it lay just over the horizon. Here, in this isolated pocket of the world, tended by a silent man, a fragile truce with life was being slowly, painstakingly negotiated. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her belly, but it no longer consumed her entirely. The rhythm of the ranch became Ilara's rhythm. The silence, once a source of unease, grew into a strange comfort. Silas continued his unspoken care. He would leave a bucket of warm water by the cot some mornings, a bar of plain soap beside it. He never looked her way when she used it, always finding some task outside or at the far end of the small cabin. Her body healed, slowly but surely. The sharp edges of pain dulled to persistent aches. She began to take tentative steps around the cabin, her movements still stiff, her balance precarious. She would trace the lines in the rough wooden table with a finger, examine the few books on the shelf, mostly almanacs and agricultural guides, besides the Bible. One day, driven by a restlessness she hadn't felt in weeks, she took the broom from its corner and began to sweep the floor. The dust rose in motes in the slivers of sunlight piercing the gloom. It was a small act, but it felt significant. When Silas returned that evening, he stopped just inside the door, his gaze sweeping the tidier space. He said nothing, of course. But he didn't put the broom back in its usual corner. He left it where she had leaned it, a silent acknowledgement. The town, however, was not as silent as Silas. News, like tumbleweeds, traveled fast across the sparse settlements. A girl, half dead, found by the hermit Silas Blackwood. The mayor's girl, some whispered, the one who'd run off or met with an accident. Thorne had spun a tale of her foolishness, her flightiness, a tragic fall while wandering where she shouldn't. Few questioned it openly. Mayor Thorne was a man to be feared. But whispers had a life of their own. One afternoon, a buggy pulled up some distance from the cabin. A woman, stout and severe, dressed in dark Sunday best, emerged. Mrs. Henderson, the preacher's wife, a self-appointed guardian of the town's morality. Ilara saw her from the small, grimy window and her heart seized. She backed away, retreating to the shadows of her cot. Silas was out on the range. Mrs. Henderson did not approach the cabin directly. She stood by her buggy, her hands clasped, surveying the isolated homestead with clear disapproval. After a few long minutes, she climbed back into her buggy and departed, leaving only a faint cloud of dust to mark her visit. But her presence lingered, a cold dread seeping back into Ilara. The sanctuary felt breached. That evening, Silas was quieter than usual, if such a thing were possible. He worked longer on his tack, his movements tighter. Ilara knew he must have seen the buggy tracks. The outside world, with its judgments and its dangers, was drawing closer. The peace of the cabin felt fragile, threatened. She found herself watching the horizon more, scanning for movement, for any sign of intrusion. The fear, which had receded, began to creep back, cold and familiar. She slept poorly, nightmares of falling, of Thorn's cold eyes, plaguing her. Silas must have noticed her renewed agitation. One morning, he left a small, crudely carved wooden bird on the crate beside her breakfast. It was rough, unfinished, but undeniably a bird, its wings slightly upturned as if in flight. She picked it up, her fingers tracing its imperfections. It was a small, solid thing in a world that felt increasingly unstable. He offered no explanation, and she expected none. It was another piece of his silent language. A gesture of reassurance, perhaps. Or maybe just a reminder that even in harsh places, small beauties could be found, or made. The town's judgment was a palpable force now, an invisible pressure against the cabin walls. The incident with Mrs. Henderson was a clear signal. They were being watched, judged. And Mayor Thorn was not a man to let matters rest, especially if he felt his narrative was being challenged by her continued existence. The small wooden bird became a talisman for Ilara. She kept it in the pocket of the oversized shirt Silas had given her, its rough edges a frequent, grounding touch. She began to contribute more to the household, small tasks at first. She washed the few dishes, refilled the water bucket from the rain barrel, kept the fire fed when Silas was out. These acts were her first tentative steps towards reclaiming a sense of agency, of usefulness. He accepted her contributions without comment, simply adjusting his own routine to accommodate hers. A silent partnership was forming, built on shared space and unspoken understanding. One afternoon, while Silas was mending a fence at the far end of his meager pasture, Ilara found herself exploring the contents of a small, dusty chest tucked under his bunk. She knew it was an intrusion, but a desperate curiosity, a need to understand the man who had saved her, drove her. Inside, beneath neatly folded work clothes, she found them, a tiny pair of worn leather baby shoes and a faded tintype photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, holding a swaddled infant. Silas's lost family. The air left Ilara's lungs. The profound, silent grief that clung to him suddenly had a face, a story. She carefully replaced the items, her heart aching with a shared sorrow. When Silas returned, she could not meet his eyes. She felt like a trespasser on sacred ground. He, however, seemed to notice a change in her, a new softness, perhaps a deeper understanding in her usually guarded gaze. He didn't question it. That evening, as the fire crackled, casting long shadows, Ilara was mending a tear in one of Silas's shirts. Her stitches were uneven, clumsy, but she persisted. He watched her, for once his gaze direct, lingering on her bent head, her fumbling fingers. The silence in the cabin felt different, charged with unspoken emotions. He rose and went to the shelf, taking down the worn Bible. He didn't open it to read, but simply held it, his thumb tracing the worn gilt lettering on its cover. Ilara felt a tremor of her own past, the stern recitations of a preacher she barely remembered, the hollow piety of people who judged her for her mother's sins, then her own. But Silas's handling of the book was different. It seemed less about doctrine and more about connection, a link to something lost. He looked at her, then, a long, searching look. "My wife," he said, his voice raspy from disuse, the word startlingly loud in the quiet room. "And my son. Fever took them." Years ago now, Ilara's needle stilled. She looked up, meeting his gaze. She saw not just the sorrow, but the raw edge of a wound that had never fully healed. She could offer no words of comfort, her own voice was still a prisoner of trauma. But she nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. An acknowledgement of his pain, a shared understanding of loss. It was a communion more profound than any words could have conveyed. The next day, the sheriff arrived. Sheriff Brody was an older man, weary, his badge dull. He didn't dismount, just reined in his horse a short distance from the cabin. Silas went out to meet him. Ilara watched from the window, her heart pounding. Their conversation was brief, voices too low to carry. But Brody's posture was stiff, Silas's unyielding. When Brody finally rode off, Silas stood for a long moment, staring after him, his jaw tight. He came back inside, his face grim. "Thorn," he said, "the name a curse. He knows you're here. He wants you back in town. Says you're a runaway," a ward of his. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. Back to town. Back to Thorn. The thought was unbearable. She looked at Silas, her eyes wide with a terror she could no longer conceal. He met her gaze, his own dark and resolute. "You ain't going," he stated, not a question, but a declaration. "This is your home now, if you want it." His words, few as they were a lifeline. She didn't speak, couldn't. But in the fragile courage that flickered in her eyes, he saw her answer. The confrontation was no longer a distant threat. It was coming. The air on the ranch grew thick with anticipation. Every distant rider, every coyote's howl, sent a jolt of anxiety through Ilara. Silas became even more watchful, his rifle always close at hand. He spent less time on the range, more time near the cabin, mending tools, sharpening his axe, his movements imbued with a grim purpose. He was preparing, not just for work, but for a fight. Ilara, too, felt a change within herself. The raw terror was still present, but it was now overlaid with a burgeoning defiance, a desperate will to protect the fragile safety she had found. She no longer hid when she saw movement on the horizon. She stood straighter, her gaze more direct. She found herself speaking, not in conversation, but in small, hesitant utterances. A soft thank you when Silas handed her a mended spoon. A whispered cold when the fire died down. Each word was a victory, a reclamation of a part of herself she thought long dead. Silas never pushed for more, simply accepting these offerings, these first green shoots of her returning voice. One morning, they saw the dust cloud in the distance, larger than a lone rider, more determined than a lost steer. It was them. Mayor Thorn, and with him, the same two brutish men who had stood on the ravine's edge, along with a handful of other townsmen, some looking ashamed, others emboldened by the mayor's presence. They rode not with the caution of Sheriff Brody, but with the arrogance of conquerors, reining in their horses in a tight, menacing semicircle before the cabin. Silas stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely at his side, but ready. He stood tall, a bulwark against the intrusion. Ilara moved to stand in the doorway behind him, her hand gripping the rough wood of the frame, her knuckles white. Thorn's eyes, cold and assessing, swept over Silas, then landed on Ilara. A cruel smile touched his lips. "Blackwood," he called out, his voice carrying an unctuous authority. "I've come for what's mine. The girl is a ward of the town, under my protection. She ran off, caused a great deal of worry. It's time she came home." Silas didn't flinch. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and steady, like stones shifting in a riverbed. "She's not going anywhere." Thorn's smile tightened. "Now, Silas, don't be foolish. This ain't your concern. She's troubled. Needs proper guidance, not the company of a reclusive hermit." He gestured to Ilara. "Come along, girl." No more theatrics. Ilara felt a tremor run through her, the old fear threatening to engulf her. She saw the faces of the townsmen, some curious, some hostile, some merely indifferent. She thought of the ravine, the pain, the loneliness. Then she looked at Silas, his unwavering stance, the quiet strength in his eyes. He was offering her a choice, a defense. And in that moment, something snapped. The years of silence, of shame, of terror, coalesced into a single, burning point of rage. Her breath came in a ragged gasp. Then, the words. No, it was a whisper, raw and shaky, but it cut through the tense silence. Thorn's eyes narrowed. What was that, girl? She took a step forward, out from the shadow of the doorway, into the harsh sunlight, beside Silas. Her voice, stronger now, clearer, resonated with a pain that was no longer just her own. I said, no. I am not going with you. You tried to kill me. A shocked murmur ran through the assembled men. Thorn's face flushed a dangerous red. Lies. The girl is hysterical, touched in the head from her fall. I saw you, Ilara continued, her gaze fixed on Thorn, unwavering. You pushed me. You left me for dead. She looked at the other townsman. He is the liar. He is the one who is cruel. Her voice, once lost, now rang with undeniable truth. Silas's hand moved slightly, resting on the stock of his rifle. He didn't raise it, but the message was clear. The townsmen shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided Thorn's furious glare. They had heard the whispers. They had seen Ilara, not a hysterical runaway, but a scarred young woman speaking with a desperate conviction. The moral certainty of Thorn's posse began to crumble. He had overplayed his hand, relying on fear and her silence. Her voice had broken his power. Thorn, seeing his authority challenged, his narrative shattered, seethed. You'll regret this, Blackwood. Both of you, he snarled, but his threats rang hollow. He looked at his men, seeking support, but found only wavering eyes and averted gazes. Defeated, his bluster gone, he wheeled his horse around. Let's go, he spat, and his men, some with visible relief, followed him, leaving Silas and Ilara standing side by side in the quiet aftermath. The dust settled. The wind sighed. Ilara was trembling, the adrenaline ebbing, leaving her weak but strangely exhilarated. She had spoken. She had stood her ground. Silas turned to her, his face unreadable for a moment. Then, a slow warmth spread in his eyes, a deep, quiet pride. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently take the wooden bird from her trembling hand, which she hadn't realized she was clutching. He turned it over, his thumb tracing its crude lines. Good, he said. Just one word. But it held a world of meaning. The threat had been faced, not with violence, but with truth and courage. The cabin, once just a shelter, now felt like a fortress, a home defended, a home earned. That evening, the fire burned bright. 2 bowls of stew sat on the table, not one. 2 mugs, Silas's old chipped one, and another, newer, plainer, he had produced from a forgotten crate. They ate in their usual quiet, but it was a different quiet now. A quiet of shared victory, of solidified peace. The land outside was still vast, still harsh. The town would still whisper. But here, within these 4 walls, a found family had taken root, defiant and strong. Ilara looked at Silas, the silent protector who had given her more than just refuge. He had given her the space to find her voice, to reclaim herself. He met her gaze, and for the first time, she offered him a small, genuine smile. He returned it, a rare, true smile that softened the harsh lines of his face, revealing the man beneath the stoic exterior. The wind still howled, but inside, there was warmth. There was safety. There was hope. And tomorrow, they would face the dawn, together. We hope you enjoyed this story of resilience and found family. If Ilara's journey from silence to strength, and Silas's quiet protection resonated with you, let us know in the comments below. What part of their story touched you the most? Don't forget to like this video if you appreciate dramatic tales of redemption, and subscribe to our channel for more inspirational short films and narrative essays. Click the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. Thanks for watching.